For the lower alcohol products, you can do something called high temperature mashing. When we're in the brew house and we extract the malt, if you extract it at a higher temperature than normal, so instead of, say, 65 degrees Celsius, you would mash at 74 degrees Celsius, you break down the starch, but not all the way down to fermentable material. And therefore you have a less fermentable wort. You can leave the yeast in that wort long enough to clean away the harsh characters, but in that fermentation, the yeast will not make a lot of alcohol. All sorts of ways of making these products. The question is, just how popular are they really? At the other extreme, we have the very alcoholic products. The world record for strong beer is currently with a brand called Utopias from the Boston Beer Company. And this contains 25.5% alcohol by volume. It's aged in wood. Not only wine that can get aged in wood, beers can too, not only this one. And it's packaged into very beautiful bottles, 700 milliliter bottles that are shaped like brewery kettles. And the last time I checked, it was retailing at $130 a bottle. And manufacturers say it should be savoured like an old sherry, a vintage port, or a fine cognac. I guess it would be at that price. My question is, why would you do it? And perhaps it's like George Mallory said when he was climbing Everest. Why? Because it is there. Because we wanted to see if we could. So tremendous diversity. Such a rich range of products in the world of beer. These are what we've explored in the last two classes. A range of ales, from the relatively gently flavoured and relatively pale, right through to the very black and dark products. And we've looked at lagers also, covering the breadth of alcoholic strength, degrees of maltiness, hoppiness, and colour. And we looked at a range of other types of product. We've looked at novel products. We've looked at new ways of pushing the boundaries of beer expression. For all of these beers, we seek consistency. We seek consistent excellence in product delivery. We want the same beer to taste the same wherever we are in the world, and so we have no surprises. And that quality manifests itself in a number of ways. It manifests itself in its appearance, the foam, the clarity, the colour, and of course in the flavour. And as we shall see in the next class, the flavour is impacted by the appearance as well. So next we will look at beer quality.
This ends Lecture 9. Brewmaster's Art, The History and Science of Beer Making, Lecture 10. The Quality of Beer. Flavor and Flavor Stability.
In these next two classes, we're going to look at the quality of beer. The quality of beer we can talk about in various categories and under various headings. And these are not mutually exclusive, because one of these elements will surely influence another. We need to start with the package. The package has got to be right. When you buy a bottle of beer, you're going to make a judgment by looking at that bottle and decide whether it's going to be a good beer or not. If the label is torn or ripped, or if the bottle is scuffed, and I said previously that beer in returnable glass bottles, those returnable glass bottles are likely to scuff, then somehow it looks less appealing, less fresh. And so you'll make a judgment based on that package. Marketing people are obsessed with clear glass and green glass. They think those are sexy colors, whereas brown glass is old-fashioned. Whereas brewers know that beer in brown glass is more stable and more able to resist light attack and so on. But the package clearly is going to make a big influence. When you pour out your beer, what's the first thing you see? You see the foam. You see the bubbles. This assumes that you actually do pour it into a glass. Please never commit the crime of drinking beer straight out of the container. It's vulgar. Pour the beer into a glass and admire the bubbles. And you're going to make a judgment. We did some work to show that if people have beers presented to them with or without foams, they will judge the beer with the foam to be more appealing, better brewed, it's going to have a better flavour. Even without tasting it, they will make a judgment based upon the foam. You look at the television screen, look at beer, it always has a foam on it. Gushing. We don't want the beer zooming out of the bottle. We don't want it frothing uncontrollably. That is a quality defect, which we don't want. And surely, if our beer gushes, we have made a decision that it's not going to be right for us. The clarity has got to be absolutely right. If the beer is clear or turbid, it's got to have the turbidity we expect. If we have a Hefeweizen, we expect it to be cloudy, but we want it to be just the right amount of cloudiness. If we buy a North American lager, we expect it to be bright. The colour also must be right. I have already said in this class that we artificially adjusted the colour of a lager-style beer and made it look like an ale, and people started saying it tasted like an ale, even though in blind tasting, without looking at the beer, there was no detectable difference. So the colour will influence your perception. So before you get to the taste of the product itself and the direct flavour impact, you've already made a judgment based upon the appearance and the packaging of the beer. And the flavour, as we shall see momentarily, is extremely complicated and isn't stable. It's changing the whole time. So flavour stability or flavour instability is a serious issue confronting the brewer. In fact, I would suggest it is the single most important challenge facing the brewer in the early 21st century. And last but not least, the quality of beer must be considered in terms of safety and wholesomeness. We don't want it to do us any harm, and might we even believe that it could do us some good. More about that in a later class. But let's start by talking about the direct influence of factors on the flavour of beer. And in this course we have looked at a number of contributors to the flavour of beer. We started by talking about malt, and the malt, depending on how it's germinated and how intensely it's kilned, will give us a range of flavour deliveries. We also talked about adjuncts. Some of these themselves will make a direct contribution to flavour, but some of them may also thin out some of the flavours. If we have an adjunct which is relatively bland, so will it ease away or modulate downwards the flavour impact of malt. So if we use a lot of sugar, for example, it will influence the maltiness delivery by thinning it out. The water will have a direct and an indirect influence on flavour. The hops, of course, will make a profound impact on flavour, whether it's bitterness or aroma. And the yeast also will make a range of materials which will contribute to flavour. Yeast will also remove materials that can have an impact on flavour. And these are not mutually exclusive. I've already said that the yeast can modulate the hoppy character. The water can influence the behaviour of the yeast, and so on. These are not mutually exclusive. The flavour of beer is detected by two instruments in your head. One of these is your tongue, and the other one is your nose. And the majority of the flavour is detected by the nose. Let's just think about your tongue. And of course on there are taste buds. And basically they are detecting the four basic flavours. Those are sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. There is a fifth flavour that the Japanese in particular talk about, and that is umami, which is this Moorishness character. And brewers have been interested in Moorishness for a while. They use the word drinkability. Nobody, I think, has ever successfully demonstrated a factor or a component of beer which influences directly and promotes drinkability. My personal experience from research many years ago is that the only thing that influences drinkability is anything that is to excess. For example, if you have overtly hoppy products, then that does not make for drinkability. It used to be said that the taste buds are located in specific regions on the tongue, and that the detection of sweet is at the tip of the tongue and sour at the sides and bitter at the back. And this is often cited as the excuse for drinking the beer and not doing what they do in the world of wine and spitting it out. You have to drink the beer, otherwise you will not get the full appreciation of the bitterness at the back of the palate. These days, people feel that the taste buds are more evenly distributed across the tongue, but we still swallow the beer. It's a dreadful waste not to. Of course, the real factor is that as you are drinking the beer, the carbon dioxide is being released and is driving volatile materials up through the back of the throat and up into the nasal passages. And that is where you are appreciating the aroma of the product. If you doubt me, then take a clothes peg and put it on your nose and then drink your beer, or eat or drink anything else for that matter, and you will detect much less. So what is happening is that you are releasing these aromas and they are being detected through the nose. A number of years ago, under the auspices of the American Society of Brewing Chemists, a group of scientists led by a man by the name of Morton Mailgard got together and developed the flavor wheel. This is a wheel, you can liken it to a clock, and on this wheel are the various flavor descriptors that an expert taster can use to classify a beer. So all the way around this clock are all these flavor terms. And an expert taster will taste the beer and will score the beer for all of these flavors on a scale of perhaps 0 to 10. 0 for undetectable, 10 to really very intense. If you look at the center of that clock, that wheel, you'll see two words. One is taste and the other one is odor. I wish they hadn't used the word odor. I wish they'd used the word aroma. I'm sure the wine people would have used the word bouquet. Odor makes me think of armpits, but nonetheless that is the word that is there. And that is all of the character which is detected by the nose. The taste is the character that is detected by the mouth. And the taste basically runs from about 8 o'clock to midnight, if you look at the clock, from 8 till 12. And we have the sour, acidic, we have the sweet, we have the salty, and of course we have the bitter. And a large part of the flavour there is listed as mouthfeel. People sometimes use the word texture. When I say to people and talk to people about the texture of beer, they say, well, it's kind of wet, isn't it? And that is true. But there are different beers with different textures. Imagine, if you will, a low-carb beer or a light beer from North America. And also imagine an Irish stout. And imagine the taste, or if you like, actually, if you're not driving, taste them now and compare the taste of these two products. And you'll find one is relatively thin and quite sharp. It's got a lot of tingle, and that's due to a large amount of carbon dioxide. The other one, the stout, is much smoother and fuller. It's got a different texture. And there are various contributors to these, but nobody is entirely sure what all the contributors are. One contributor for sure is carbon dioxide. The higher the carbon dioxide content of a beer, the more tingle you have. The carbon dioxide is not reacting with any taste buds. What it is being detected by is the so-called trigeminal sense. It's the pain mechanism. The same mechanism that detects chili peppers, capsaicin, is also detecting carbon dioxide. So you're hurting when you drink a highly carbonated product, and you love it masochistically. And so it's giving this tingle, this pain reception, and that is influencing the mouthfeel delivery. In the Irish Stout, you'll have some nitrogen gas. I've talked about nitrogen before, and I'll talk about it again. It gives the foam stability. It suppresses hoppy character, but it gives this smooth character. I know of ales in cans that contain widgets. They have got a real smoothness. Personally, it's not to my satisfaction, but some people like it. So the nitrogen is influencing the mouthfeel, the texture, by giving this smooth character. In part, it's because these beers contain less carbon dioxide, but the nitrogen itself is having a direct impact. So that's 8 till 12 o'clock on this clock. From 12 round the way, all the way around to 8, through 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, is all the other character, the aroma. And we have a range of characters here, through the grainy characters and the cereal-like characters, through to sulphury and so on. A range of characters contributed by malt, contributed by hops, contributed by yeast, and to an extent contributed by water. So it's very, very complicated. In the world of wine, they talk about wine containing 1,000 or so different chemical species. In the world of beer, we have perhaps 2,000 chemical species contributed by a greater number of raw materials and by the yeast itself. And each of these chemical materials has got a flavor threshold. The flavor threshold is the concentration at which a substance is detectable. So the lower is the flavor threshold, the more potent it is as a flavor compound. If something is detectable at very low concentrations, it's very, very potent. So you may have flavor thresholds that are really rather small, and other compounds that are really have got a very high flavor threshold. And of course it depends upon the type of product that you have. If you are doing these experiments to try to measure a flavor threshold, they're typically done in water or an alcohol solution, and you add the chemical compound to it in increasing quantities and see how much you need to add to get detection. But that's a bit different from a beer. Again, compare a North American light beer with an Irish stout. And if you add increasing quantities of a substance to these beers, you will detect it first in the light beer before the stout, because there are other materials in the stout which will disguise and which will hide this added substance. Sweetness is due to residual sugars that are not fermented out, or due to sugars that you might add to the product, so-called priming sugars. In an earlier class, I talked about sweet stout. I talked about lactose, used to add a degree of sweetness. Some brewers will balance the flavor delivery, the taste delivery, by adding a little bit of extra sugar. The sourness, of course, is due to acid. If you want to have an example in other types of foodstuff, then suck a lemon. Then you've got acid. That's citric acid. It's sour. Most of the acid in most beers is released by the yeast, and the more extensive the yeast ferments, then the more sourness it will produce, more acid it will release. Most beers are in the pH range of 3.9 to 4.6. The higher you go in that range, the closer you get to 4.6, the less sour, almost the more mellow the product. If you go down below 3.9, and we talked about beers like the lambics, then you have a much more sour product. And if you don't have the fruit addition, the cherries or so on, then you are going to have a very sour product. There may be drinking occasions where you want to have that. So the lower the pH, the more sour. Remember too that the acid itself also will impact more than sourness, but also other flavor characters. So if you have a lot of acetic acid, then you're going to have a more vinegary flavor, more butanoic acid than a buttery flavor. Pentanoic acid will give you the delicious aroma of sweat. We don't want that in too many beers. But methyl butanoic acid, cheesy and old hops. And that, as I've said in an earlier class, is a symptom of bad storage of hops. And then octanoic acid, goaty. Let me say at this point, it really is up to you what you want. There is a beer that I know that is clearly loaded with some of these acids and gives quite robust levels of some of these characters that, to my palate, is a challenge. But nonetheless, it's a point of interest and very different. Perhaps you ought to think cheese. Many people enjoy a great many cheeses that have got fairly robust flavors, and that adds a degree of interest to the beer market, some of the products with these depths of flavor. If I said beer contains salt, you might be a bit surprised, but there is a salty character to beers, and this is due to sodium and potassium. The saltiness of the sodium chloride that you have in your salt cellar, that is due to the sodium, not the chloride. So sodium and potassium both impact a degree of saltiness to products, and the higher the level of sodium or potassium, the greater will be this detectable element. Actually, beer contains rather more potassium than it does sodium, and it's favorable from the perspective of the sodium-potassium balance you want in your body. The bitterness, of course, comes from the hops, from the iso-alpha acids, which we have talked about in the context of the boiling of wort, and also produced in alternative ways in these days with pre-isomerized extracts and liquid forms of bitterness. There are 6 different iso-alpha acids that you can derive from a hop. And these 6 iso-alpha acids have somewhat different bitterness and different intensity of flavor. And so by choosing your hop, and also choosing the way in which you carry out the isomerization and the extraction, so you can dial in different degrees of bitterness. Of course, iso-alpha acids are sensitive to light, and they break down in the presence of light to form a chemical substance. Let's not worry about the name, but we call it MBT, which has the aroma of the skunk. If your beer is in green glass or clear glass bottle, it will have an increased likelihood of this occurring. There are some people who actually like it. I always believe in consistency, and therefore I believe that you should have always the appropriate degree of any flavor character. So if your beer is prone to skunkiness, then for goodness sake, make sure it's always equally skunky. The worst thing in the world is have to have some batches of beer that is not skunky and some that is. If you want to prevent this absolutely, then you can use these modified bitter acids. They are so-called reduced preparations, and these are resistant to light deterioration. They also actually have better foaming properties, and also are actually more bitter. So if you do use these materials, you do change the bitterness perception as well, and you have to change the amount you add appropriately. If you consider the taste of beer, or any other foodstuff for that matter, then the intensity of flavor delivery changes with time. And so flavor scientists and sensory scientists talk about time intensity. So take a sip of beer, And for a moment, for a fraction of a second, or perhaps even longer, you won't detect much. And then the flavor delivery will build up. For example, bitterness. And the bitterness detection will build up until it reaches a maximum, and then it will subside again. Eventually, hopefully, you will no longer detect the bitterness. And so there is a time intensity profile. The rate of pickup of a character such as bitterness, or any other character for that matter, and then the rate at which it subsides. And this will be different for different chemical compounds that we find in beer. It's arguable, and as we scientists say, more research is needed, preferably research involving the drinking of beer. More research is needed, but it's arguable that what we want is a detection of the flavor compound to the appropriate level, and then what we call a rapid finish. We want it not to linger. Imagine, if you will, eating some fish, and it kind of lingers with you for quite a long time. If that happens with a beer, then, and again it's arguable, but I believe this to be the case, if it happens for beer, that lessens drinkability, because you have this accumulation of flavor on the palate. A quick finish actually makes for drinkability. You are not holding back intense flavors that are going to detract from your next sip or your next beer or anything that you're consuming alongside the beer. So this whole time intensity area is worthy of further investigation. And I think it's particularly relevant when we talk about hoppiness. I've already said that I believe personally that excess hoppy character is to the detriment of drinkability. Having said which, I take great delight in those beers that are hopped appropriately with the right balance of hoppiness complementing the other elements of beer. At least 300 different chemical species contribute to hop aroma, and these are not well characterized. We know some. We know, for example, that a compound called myrcene is probably best at relatively low levels, and other compounds like linalool are appropriate and may be desirable in some of the noble hop aroma. It's interesting in the world of hop aroma that we use words like we do in the world of wine. And indeed, some of the chemical species, some of the compounds involved are very similar between hops and grapes. It really is in the world of hops that we find the closest links, perhaps, to the world of wine. I've already said in an earlier class that the classic way to detect hop aroma is to rub the hops between your hands and smell. The character you'll get in the finished beer does not necessarily link very easily to the aroma you detect in the hop. There is change taking place. In the late hop character, changes due to the yeast. But the control of hop aroma is on the detection of the right hop for you and adding it the right place, the right time, in the right quantity. At the moment, there are very few instrumental methods that are available to help you control that process. Going back to the malt, then there is a wide range of malts available. And as we heard in an earlier class, these are dependent on the extent of modification taking place, the extent of germination taking place, and on the intensity of kilning. If we have the workhorse malt, the pale ale malt, it's got a kind of biscuity flavour and a fairly pale colour. If we allow the malt to stew a little bit more, so you get more sugar and amino acid production, and then heat to a somewhat higher temperature, then we will produce flavours such as sweet and nutty, toffee and caramel. And now we have malts like the Carapils and the crystal malt and the amber malt. If we take the basic pale ale malt and we roast it, relatively dry roasting, then we will produce much higher colours and flavours like mocha and treacle. And then we can go to black malts with very high colours, giving the smoky coffee characters, and the roasted barley, not malted at all, roast barley, burnt, smoky characters, which are very important in stout beers. So the malts we can play tunes with as well. If we want a dark beer, which has not got a burnt, harsh character, but was got a toffee, caramel character, we want a lot of colour, then we will replace the pale ale with quite a lot of something like crystal malt or carapils malt. So you put a lot of colour in there, but also you don't introduce burnt characters, you do introduce these sweeter toffee-like characters. If, however, you want a stout, then you're going to use more of the roast barley and the black malt to get that colour with the burnt coffee characters. When we talked about yeast, we talked about diacetyl, butterscotch flavour, which has got a very low flavour threshold, and we have to eliminate it if we want to avoid our beer smelling of butterscotch. And the yeast will do that for us. There's actually a substance very similar to diacetyl called pentanedione, and that's got an aroma of honey. We don't want that either. And that too will be removed by the yeast on prolonged fermentation. If we talk about compounds that have somewhat more desirable flavour, then we can go into the realm of the esters. And the esters have fruit-like character. And there are a range of esters present in beer. The esters are very prominent in wines, giving the fruity-like characters. And the stronger the beer, the more estery it's likely to be. As I said when I talked about fermentation, if you have a highly sugar-containing wort and you ferment it, you're going to produce more esters. One ester is ethyl acetate, and this gives a character somewhat like pears. So if you smell a pear, then you have ethyl acetate. Even more important is an ester called isoamyl acetate, and this has got the aroma of bananas. I can think of a very prominent North American lager, which if you smell it carefully and critically, then you can detect the gentle aroma of banana. When we talked about Weizen beers, the German wheat beer from Bavaria, I said that it had a pronounced banana-like character. That is because of these high levels of esters. And these are produced by the yeast. And it's a good illustration of how you need to control fermentation conditions if you're going to control the amount of ester character. You have to use the right yeast strain. Different yeasts will make different amounts of these esters. You have to control the amount of oxygen you give to the yeast. If you give yeast a lot of oxygen, then it will produce less esters. But if you don't put enough oxygen into your wort, then the yeast will produce more esters. So it's by controlling the amount of yeast, by controlling the amount of oxygen, and also by controlling the strength of the wort, because if you have very, very strong wort, you will produce more esters. In those ways, you can influence and control the ester character in the beer. And this is what we seek to do. We don't want surprises. We don't want one batch which is estery and the next batch not. We want to control it. One other ester is phenyl ethyl acetate, which gives the delicious aroma of roses. Right for the right beer. So ester control is a marvellous example of the importance of yeast to beer flavour. Now, if you've got a robust, very burnt, roast, harsh stout, then it's harder to detect these esters than it is in a North American light beer. Again, because the flavour threshold in those stout beers is going to be much higher. There is a range of sulfur-containing compounds in beer, and compounds containing sulfur tend to have fairly intense flavours. Thinking back to cheese again, there's a lot of sulfur-containing compounds in cheese. Well, there are a lot of sulfur-containing compounds in beer as well. The simplest of these is hydrogen sulfide, which of course has the aroma of rotten eggs. Now, many of you will say, oh, no, we don't want any beer. We don't want any beer smelling of rotten eggs. Actually, that's not true. Or perhaps not rotten eggs, but a little bit eggy. If you go to Burton-on-Trent, England, and you freshly broach a cask of Burton ale, then we rejoice in an initial detection of a slight egginess. And then that subsides and the dry hop character comes through. So a little bit of hydrogen sulfide might actually be quite helpful, but not too much. Again, it depends on the beer. One sulfur-containing compound which has attracted a lot of interest is something called DMS, dimethyl sulfide. DMS is claimed to be a major contributor to the aroma of lager-style beers, and many other things as well. If you want to know what DMS smells like, open a can of corn, can of sweet corn, and smell. That is DMS. Or open a bottle of tomato ketchup, DMS. Or milk that is slightly turning, DMS. Go to the ocean and inhale DMS. And if you want an example of this in lager, a bottle of Rolling Rock would do just nicely, DMS. For some beers, for some lagers, the brewers insist on having very, very low levels of DMS. Others insist on having high levels, for example, Rolling Rock. And it's a compound which is controlled to a very, very tight schedule, tight level. The flavor threshold for DMS is a good example. It's 30 micrograms per litre, 30 parts per billion, which is quite low. And I was charged with the task when I was research manager of Bass of explaining how we could control that. And we did, to a very tight level for our beer. And we felt a little bit was important to give a good lager character, but not too much. And by controlling the level of the material that it derives from in the malt, and by controlling the boiling of the wort, you can control the amount of DMS. Yeast also will make DMS, so you have to control the fermentation also. And so it's a good example of how we control everything from the malt, and the precursor of the DMS was specified in the malt. We control the brew house conditions, the boiling stage, and we control fermentation, specifically to regulate and control the level of DMS in the beer. There are other sulfur-containing compounds, dimethyl disulfide, which gives a rotten veg character, methyl thioacetate, cabbagey, and of course the ultimate in sulfur-containing compounds, MBT, which we've talked about as the skunkiness. Each to his or her own. If we dwell on DMS for a moment, then I'd like to tell you a story. In Burton-on-Trent were the headquarters for our beer. We had breweries all over the United Kingdom, but the standard was in Burton-on-Trent, and our DMS level was defined there, and everybody else had to match it. Up in Scotland, they had a lower level of DMS in their beer. And as a research manager, I was detailed to fly up to Scotland and to correct the error of their ways. Now, you may know that there's a gentle and friendly rivalry between the English and the Scots. So when I arrived in Glasgow, they told me, and I'll give you the polite version, to go back to England and to explain why the perception of DMS in their beer was exactly the same degree of perception we had in our beer, even though their level was substantially lower than ours. I should go back and explain it, because if they were going to increase the DMS level in their beer, then it would be, quote, through the roof and undrinkable. So I went back and put the challenge to my colleague Roy, the man who drank the Worthington White Shield each day. And what he found was there was a remarkable inverse relationship between the perception of DMS and the level of phenylethanol and phenyl ethyl acetate, which we've talked about rose character. The more phenyl ethanol, more phenyl ethyl acetate, the less was the perception of the DMS. This rose-like character was masking the DMS. And when we measured the level of this rose-like substances in the Glasgow lager, it was lower than it was in the Burton lager. And therefore the perception of DMS was indeed greater at the lower concentration. I went back to Glasgow to tell them this, and they were very delighted that I confirmed their perception. But I did point out to them that the reason was that they were not following group policy, and that they were in fact fermenting at the wrong temperature. They were fermenting it too cold. And I was sent back to England rapidly and told to mind my own business. So yeast produces a range of flavour compounds. Some yeasts produce extra ones. We encountered one earlier in this course when I talked about the ale yeast that is used to make Weizenbiers in Germany. This contains an extra gene for an enzyme that will make the phenolic character, the clove-like character. And this yeast is very special for those types of beers and should always be employed to make classic Weizenbier products. So there are many flavour compounds contribute to the aroma delivery and the taste delivery of beer. One thing that I really advocate is balance. If you have a product that is out of balance, it's either excessively hoppy or excessively malty even, then it's not going to make for drinkability. So what I advocate is you have a real tempering of extremes of flavour. If you are going to have a very malty product, for goodness sake, make sure it has a depth of body and an intensity of body that is going to warrant that extra hoppiness. If you have that balance, I personally believe you will have drinkability. Before I leave flavour, I'd like to talk about flavour change. It's true to say that for most beers they are never better than when they are first put into the bottle. As soon as they are packaged, then the clock starts ticking and it's downhill. There are some that may improve in flavour with time, and typically these would be the more alcoholic products. Because you're going to get the same sorts of changes that you have in a wine, for example. You're going to get reactions between some alcohols and some acids and so on to change the flavour in interesting ways. But certainly for the lower alcohol products, it's downhill. And a number of changes will take place. There is a decrease in the bitterness of the beer. And this we can measure. We can see those bitter acids disappearing slowly. And it really does depend on how you store the beer. There is an increase in a sweet caramel toffee-like character with time. There is an increase and a decrease in a character known as ribes. Some people politely call it black currant buds. Some people less politely call it tomcat urine. Whichever way, it's probably not entirely desirable. And there is a build-up, a progressive increase in a wet paper or cardboard-like character. So if you store your beer, then progressively it's going to develop these characteristics. And it will be more obvious the gentler the flavour of the beer. Now the chemistry of this flavour change is tremendously complicated, and it's attracting the interests of scientists like myself and many others all over the world to try to find ways of minimizing this. There are three basic ways of doing it. The first of these is to make sure that you have the lowest possible oxygen content in your beer. Oxygen speeds up this deterioration. So this is why brewers go out of their way to minimize the air levels in the package, in the bottle, in the can, in the keg. The lower, the better. Incidentally, air will creep in between the bottle and the crown cork with time. And although people may not like to hear it, this means that beer in a can has got a higher quality for longer than beer in a bottle. There is this perception that beer in a can is somehow less good. People say, well, it tastes metallic. That's not true. I defy you to taste beer blind without knowing whether it came out of a bottle or a can. I defy you to tell me which one it came out of. But beer in a can will not allow oxygen to creep in, whereas beer in a bottle will. That is why one well-known North American brewer recently went back from these twist-off crown corks to the pry-off crown corks, because they are a firmer attachment to the top of the bottle. You can actually buy crown corks that have got oxygen scavengers embedded inside the crown cork. That's a rather expensive option. One thing I urge you to do, particularly those of you living in hot locations, is to keep the beer cold. The higher the temperature, the more rapid is the aging. So if I have my beer at room temperature, let's say that's 20 Celsius, then it will last about 3 months. But for every 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, it will age 2 to 3 times faster. So if it lasts 3 months at 20 degrees Celsius, if it's at 30 degrees Celsius, then it's going to last 1 month. And if it's at 40 degrees Celsius, which it well could be in my garage in Davis, California, then it will last a week at most before I detect staling. However, if I keep it in my refrigerator, then it will last a very, very, very long time indeed. So the temperature has a profound effect. The last factor is sulfur dioxide or bisulfite, metabisulfite. This is a great stabilizer. It binds the substances which make beer taste cardboardy. And if you have enough sulfur dioxide, it will do that, and it will keep the beer fresh for longer. There's an inherent reluctance in the United States of America to use SO2, because if you add sulfur dioxide over 10 milligrams per litre, 10 parts per million, you have to label it on the bottle or the can. Contains sulfites. I defy you to find a beer in the United States of America that has those words, contains sulfites. You will find those words on another type of alcoholic beverage. So that's flavour, and in the next class we will address the other aspects of beer quality.
This ends Lecture 10. Remember to visit this course's website at www.modernscholar.com, where you'll find additional information about the lectures you just heard. If you borrowed this course from a public library and would like your own copy of the course guide for future reference, call Recorded Books at 1-800-636-3399 and we'll send you a free copy. A shipping charge will apply. Brewmaster's Art, The History and Science of Beer Making, Lecture 11. The Quality of Beer, Appearance.
In the last class we talked about the flavour of beer. And as I introduced that class, I said that a number of other factors will influence the perceived flavour of the product. You'll make a judgment based upon the appearance of the beer. And when we talk about the appearance of beer, then the big point of difference between beer and other types of alcoholic beverage is the presence of a foam. The presence of a stable foam is generally considered to be desirable. Some people actually say, oh, I don't like all that foam. And certainly I've been to restaurants where they've gone out of their way to avoid making the foam. The reality is that when you ask people questions about the perception of beer, they invariably score a beer that contains foam as being better. We knew when we did studies in Bass that if we did a trial to look at the flavour difference between two beers, if we made the mistake of having one beer with a better head than the other, then that would invariably also be scored the highest for flavour. So foam is very, very important. And when we talk about foam, we can talk about it in various headings or various categories. The first, of course, is that we have to produce the foam in the first place. And of course, the foam is due to the presence of gas in the beer, carbon dioxide in the beer. The more carbon dioxide in the beer, the more foam you can produce. But you know, you can pour out a beer that is full of carbon dioxide and get very little foam on it. Equally, you can pour a beer with relatively low levels of carbon dioxide and produce a lot of foam on it. So you can take a high carbonation beer, and you can try that for yourself, and just take the top off and pour it ever so slowly into a glass, and you won't produce a lot of foam. But if you take a low carbonation beer and pour it with vigour, you'll get lots and lots of foam. What you have to do is to nucleate the bubbles. And nucleation is a very complicated science, and I can't hope to explain it to you now. But you have to have a nucleation site to make these bubbles. Here's a trick. Take a glass and scratch the bottom of the glass and pour your beer into it and look at the beer. And you'll see a stream of bubbles rising through the beer from the scratch that you've made in the glass. That scratch is a nucleation site, and that is where bubbles are forming. And it's a trick that some brewers actually use. They design glasses that have got little notches in the bottom that promote this nucleation. It's a phenomenon that some people call beading. It's often considered to be very appealing to see the stream of bubbles rising through the glass. The good thing also is it replenishes the foam at the top of the glass all the time. Another nucleation device is the widget. And you may have detected a slightly negative way in which I said widget there, but some people like them. And that is a device to actually promote foaming in a relatively low carbonation product. So you need to form the foam in the first place. But you can take lots of other types of beverage which contain lots of carbon dioxide, and they will not give you a stable foam. Imagine, if you will, a highly carbonated soda, or a drink such as champagne. Lots of bubbling going on. I think in the world of champagne they use words like mousson or something like that. And it collapses instantly. Why is that? Well, the reason is that if you make a lot of bubbles, it's not thermodynamically desirable. There's a force called surface tension. If I take a drop of water and I put it onto a clean bench, the water will occupy a spherical shape. That is the smallest surface area commensurate with the volume of liquid that you have. The water wants to contract on itself to make a small surface area as possible. If you make lots and lots of bubbles, then you're making a huge surface area, which is counter to surface tension. So the bubbles collapse. And this is what happens in a soda or champagne. The difference with beer is that you have a set of materials which come from the raw ingredients of beer which stabilize the foam. And there are two major ones. They are protein and the bitter acids. The proteins come from the grain. They come from the malt. These are so-called hydrophobic proteins, water-hating proteins. And because they are hydrophobic, they are water-hating, they prefer to leave the beer and go into the bubble wall and stay in the bubble wall, away from the watery content of the beer. And when they get into the bubble wall, they like to interact with one another and linger and hold the wall together, the bubble wall together. These proteins are even better from wheat. If you compare the proteins molecule for molecule from wheat or from barley, they're even better from the wheat. And that is why if you have wheat beers, you have very stable foam. The second component is the bitter content of the beer, the iso-alpha acids. And these bridge the proteins to form a skeleton which holds the bubble wall together. The more bitterness, the more stable will be the foam. Those different iso-alpha acids, the 6 different isoalpha acids have got different foaming properties. And when you reduce those isoalpha acids, those preparations that are used to prevent skunking, they give a much higher degree of hydrophobicity, and therefore they are much more potent as foam stabilizers. And so you'll find that beers that are made with these bitter acids that prevent skunking, they give very stable foams. And the texture of those foams is very different. So here's another experiment. The wonderful thing about studying foam is there's lots of experiments to do. Here's another one, and that is to take a beer, a North American lager in a brown glass bottle, and a North American lager from an equally large brewing company in North America in a clear glass bottle, and pour them out and look at the foams, and you'll see that they are very different. One gives fine bubbles, and the other one gives a much coarser, more stable foam. And that is the reason why. It's because of the bitter acids. Your next experiment is this, and that is to take 2 bottles of beer, same beer, and 2 glasses, and pour the beer to the same height, to the same foam in both glasses. The first one, drink it straight away. The second one, wait a moment, pause, contemplate life in general, and allow the beer to stand. And what will happen, in the first glass that you've drunk straight away, there'll be virtually no foam left, maybe a little bit at the bottom. But on the other one, when you start to sip the beer in a gracious way, the foam will start to lace the side of the beer glass. The reason is that the proteins and the bitter acids stick together, and it takes a little bit of time. And when they interact, they change the foam from being kind of wet and liquid to a more stable, solid form, the form in which it will lace or cling to the side of the beer glass. And you will have these bands of lacing around the side of the glass. And so by the time you've finished drinking this beer, you will have this lacing pattern. I like to call it cathedral windows of foam. Now, why deny yourself this delight? By drinking the beer straight out of the bottle, you deny yourself this hedonic satisfaction of seeing this lacing pattern on the side of the glass. I used to say that actually this is the ultimate manifestation of foam quality. The ultimate thing is this lacing, because you had to have produced the foam, and it had to be stable, and it had to have this interaction taking place. So everything comes together with lacing. That was until we did a piece of work which suggested that some people actually didn't like lacing. And if I may be so bold, I would point out that those who did not like the lacing so much were invariably female, whereas men preferred the lacing. I think the women thought it was somehow dirty. The reality is that the lacing at the side of the glass is a sign of glass cleanliness, because glass cleanliness is absolutely critical for foam quality. So the texture is very, very important in the beer, and the texture influences this stability. The whiteness also is important. Some beer foams look white, and they tend to have very, very small bubbles. Think of a well-known Irish stout, and think of those very, very small bubbles, that really white foam, influencing your perception of that product and very much influencing the stability of the foam. The bubble size then is very important. The optimum thing is to have all of your bubbles exactly the same size. Incidentally, some people think it's tremendously sad that I should get so excited about beer bubbles, but I know how important it is to beer quality. So the ultimate is to have all of your bubbles small and all equally small. If you have a mixture of bubble sizes, then gas will pass from the small bubble to the big bubble. And the small bubble will get smaller and the big bubble will get bigger. Eventually the small bubble will disappear and you have half as many bubbles, and they're all big and ugly and bladdery and less attractive.